for having us again. You know, I guess we'll do introductions. I'm Sarah Greenfield. I am a project manager and engineer in DEQ's cleanup program. I've worked with some of you in the past. We've provided some updates, but it's been a pretty long time ago. So it's nice to connect once again. I'm here with Blair Paulik, who is the project manager for the former Hope and Talbot site, and Jeff Schatz, who is the project manager for the Boise site. It looks like we're going to need to get permission maybe to share our screen. Is that something that, Rochelle, you can provide? Or someone else posting?
When I tried to share, it said that the host disabled participant screen sharing. So I think we would either be I would need to be made a host, or we could also send you a link to share.
Rochelle, that's on your end over there since you logged into our main account.
I believe I just fixed it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try again.
Can share simultaneously. I believe that I just fixed that. Sorry, it was settling the dogs.
There it goes. Blair, do you want to pull up the main?
That is a different screen that I intended to share. I will try one more time.
Yeah, so while Blair's getting us set up, I think we figured it might be nice just to kind of keep this informal, with the intention of it being kind of conversational. You know, our goal is just to provide updates on where we're at in terms of cleanup in Scappoose Bay, and also maybe highlight some opportunities or, you know, offer to collaborate or continue to update you as you are interested or would like as our cleanups proceed, because we're kind of excited that we're finally at a pretty big milestone, I'd say, for each of the 3 sites that we're going to talk about today. So you're going to be seeing a lot more activity and a lot more going on as work proceeds at these different sites. So I think, Blair, if you want to just pull up the first cleanup, the main cleanup page first. I just wanted to show folks how they can get to this.
Or yeah, here we go. This?
Yeah, exactly. So if you you know, want to learn more about anything that we talk about today, I just wanted to kind of show you how you can get there on your own. If you just Google in DEQ Scappoose Bay cleanup, it'll take you to this site, which is the DEQ site, where we just have a little bit of a blurb on the Scappoose Bay itself, and the different sites that we're working on in the Bay. We have a link to the fish advisory that Oregon Health Authority issued back in 2020 for the Bay, with some recommendations on the safe quantities of fish and shellfish that you can eat. And then as you scroll down, we've got individual sections for each of the 3 sites we're going to talk about today: Armstrong, Hope and Talbot, and Boise Cascade. And within each of those, there are some links that'll take you to our environmental database, where you can access different documents, reports, and some summaries of the status of each of these sites. So this is just a really great resource if there's anything else you want to kind of follow up on after this. And then one of the new things that we just added to this site in preparation for this call actually is this story map that we want to walk through, and Blair is pointing to a link to it here. So we were planning to just kind of walk through visually these different sites. And then, like I said, if you have any questions or thoughts as we go along, feel free to interrupt. And we are just focused on these 3 major sites right now. But for those of you who are already pretty familiar with DEQ's work in the Bay, for completeness, I wanted to point out there are a couple other sites as well. Just up the bay, between the marina and Armstrong, is another site called Multnomah Plywood. which is currently owned by the Port of Columbia County. And that is a site that DEQ has assessed and has determined is one that's going to require some additional environmental investigations. But we have not yet formally brought it into our cleanup program. That's something that's likely to occur down the road. So nothing really active happening yet at that site. And then the other one you may be pretty familiar with is downstream from Boise, Cascade, and it's the former veneer site, which is the future home of the waterfront redevelopment plan that the city of St. Helens is currently planning. And that site was in DEQ's program. It received a no further action, meaning no further cleanup is required. But there are still some areas that need to be managed appropriately if there's redevelopment, you know, disturbance of the ground, et cetera. So there's not a lot of DEQ activity going on there, but it was formerly in DEQ's site, and there is kind of like a long-term O&M component to it, but not a lot of active cleanup. So that is kind of just the lay of the land, I guess. And then we will just dive through and provide some history using this story map on each of the 3 sites. So if you want to go ahead and scroll down, Blair, we're first going to start with a conversation around Armstrong World Industries. This is the site that I manage, and it's located centrally there at that number 1 mark. And then we will move down to Pope and Talbot, and then on to Boise. And again, within this story map, there are links to our database here as well if you want to get more information. All right, so diving into Armstrong. Oh, and I can't see hands or the chat very well. So just, you know, holler if you have a question and we're not responding. All right, so Armstrong World Industries. This is a very large cleanup site. It's roughly 175 acres. And it's composed of kind of 2 distinct cleanup areas. The first is about 36-acre upland portion, and that is where you see all the buildings and the roads and where all the former operations historically took place. The other piece is 100 or more acres that surround the upland that we call the lowland or in-water area. And the vast majority of those areas are wetlands. So they are, you know, low-lying, lots of vegetation, variable water levels influenced by the tides. I mean, all kinds of species of, you know, plants and animals that live there. And the property has been used for fiberboard manufacturing since 1929, all the way up through 2018, when the plant was recently closed. Former owners were Furtex Insulation Board, Danton Russell, Kaiser Gypsum, Owens Corning, and Armstrong, who currently owns the property. And although it has been shut down since 2018, Armstrong has been actively marketing the property for sale since then. There's been a number of interested parties that have fallen through, but there continue to be folks very interested in acquiring this property. So while it is currently vacant, we do expect that it will be put back into use very soon, potentially as soon as by the end of this year. And so that's something that we need to consider as we are planning to conduct our cleanup. And then I threw this photo in here just to kind of give you a sense of what, you know, the facility looked like back in 1930. And what I love about this is this was, you know, one of the first structures built at the site, and it still stands today and looks very much as it does now if you were to go out to the site. So while this facility has expanded and changed over time, some of these buildings are still the original ones. So in terms of investigation history, as you might expect, a lot of the contamination that we see at this site is associated with those former manufacturing operations that occurred between 1929 and 2018. Most importantly, it was untreated wastewater. So basically, in the board manufacturing process, there was a lot of water mixed with various additives that were then pressed into boards, dried, and then the excess water drained off and discharged directly through a series of outfalls into the wetlands and ultimately into Scappoose Bay. And this was one of the primary sources of contamination, specifically to the lowland. And then there were also a number of more localized sources of contamination as well. There were a number of spills of various fuels that were stored on site in some above ground storage tanks, various burn pits located around the site, disposal of waste, municipal waste, but also things like paint and other byproducts. And also a sawdust pile, which was generated as the boards were being cut and after they already were glued and included various additives. And so that sawdust pile itself was also highly contaminated and has since been removed. So since 2010, DEQ has been working with Armstrong and Kaiser and Owens Corning to complete a remedial investigation to really get a better handle on, the nature and extent of contamination in both the upland and the lowland areas of the property. We were able to complete a draft remedial investigation and risk assessment in 2015, but we're never able to finalize them. And that's because Kaiser Gypsum, who is one of the primary responsible parties for contamination, ended up going bankrupt in 2016. And so all work at the site ended up having to stop. DEQ then filed a claim in bankruptcy court for what we thought the rest of the cleanup would cost. And through negotiations in the bankruptcy proceedings, we ultimately were able to receive a combined $77 million settlement from the three primary responsible parties. In addition to the $77 million, we also got Armstrong to agree to fund and implement cleanup of the upland portion of the property. And that was valued at about $1.4 million. I say that because you may wonder why it's $1.4 million to do the entire upland, and we have $77 million to do the rest. And that's because working in wetlands and trying to clean up the surrounding area is going to be very, very hard and very costly. So that's something that we have to keep in mind now that we have a set amount of money to do this work. That will dictate, how we proceed with cleanup at this site. And the settlements are not only used to fund cleanup, but another stipulation is that it will be used for habitat restoration and mitigation projects within the Scappoose Bay watershed. So this is an area that I really think there could be an opportunity to work with some of the restoration efforts that Scappoose Bay Watershed Council leads to maybe leverage some funds and maximize our impact to the watershed. So in terms of the contaminants of concern here, it's often associated with the raw materials that were used in the manufacturing process, additives and preservatives, and those types of sources. The primary drivers of risk at the site are some organic compounds called dioxins and furans. Those are can cause significant impacts to the environment and wildlife and people, even at very, very low concentrations. And we also have metals at this site, particularly arsenic. One of the additives used in the process was arsenic trioxide, which is one of the most toxic forms and was intended to kill off vermin and insects that might want to gnaw on the boards. So it was designed to, you know, impact wildlife. That was its original intent, and it was discharged right out into the wetlands. And then also we have, to a lesser extent, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, which are mostly associated with those historic spills of the various fuels that were stored on site. So in terms of risks to human health and the environment, the upland risks are really limited to direct contact with those upland soils. For site workers that might come into contact with them. And then secondary to that, there's also a concern about upland soils migrating into the wetlands. In the lowlands, the concern is mostly about the accumulation of these contaminants into fish, clams, and crayfish that could then impact the health of the people who eat them. They also have levels high enough at this site that it can also pose a direct health threat to the fish and wildlife themselves. So as we mentioned kind of at the very beginning, Oregon Health Authority did issue a health advisory back in December of 2020 that includes some recommendations on the safe levels of resident fish, shellfish, and crayfish that you can consume in Scappoose Bay. And there's a link to that there in the story map. So in terms of the upland, there was an extensive investigation that DEQ oversaw that included sampling of soil and groundwater, catch basin solids from the stormwater system, stormwater itself, and some of the feedstock materials that were used in the process. And the results of that investigation found that the highest contaminant concentrations are generally in the area south of the main facility building. And so those are the areas that are colored here in this graphic off to the right, generally the areas that are in red and orange. There was a feasibility study conducted in March 2016 that looked at the different cleanup options for the upland, and then DEQ selected a final remedy in our record of decision on June 2018. And the real goal of the upland cleanup was to address contaminated surface soils in the upland portion of the site, such that they will not be in contact with the workers who work at the facility. This cleanup was completed in summer of 2019, and it included excavation of what we call hotspot areas. So those are the ones shown in red. Those areas were removed and then taken off site for disposal in a landfill. And then the majority of the rest of the site is a cap. So where there are already existing buildings and roads, asphalt, those are caps that need to be maintained. And then where there weren't already caps in place, we installed some engineered caps, which essentially were about a 1 foot gravel layer with kind of a demarcation fabric beneath it so that we knew and could monitor the thickness of those gravel caps over time. So those are the areas shown in orange and yellow. In addition to that, there's also some institutional controls, which are really just ways that we try to further protect people by limiting access to the site, like trespassers. And so there's site security 24/7 at Armstrong to prevent that. And there is signage to keep people off the site. So this is now completed. And the focus of the work that we're doing now is largely on the lowland, so the surrounding wetlands. And we've been working in the lowland for a long time. There was an investigation completed back in around 2010 that included sampling of soil, sediment, and aquatic organisms. So we actually sampled the fish, the bass, the carp, and some crayfish and clams as well. And what we found was, to no surprise, the highest contaminant concentrations in the lowland are right at that upland and lowland boundary where those wastewater outfalls discharged for the facility for many, many years. And here we have just some photos to give you a sense of how hard it is to conduct environmental investigations at this site. You know, I was mentioning all the vegetation, and there's also very soft soils. So we essentially had to have people walking around in waders everywhere. You can see off to the left, someone collecting a sediment core sample. And then we also had to use specialized boats with very low draft and time our sampling when water levels were the very highest to collect the data that we needed to collect, with the goal of being collecting data that is high enough resolution that we can use it for ultimately for remedial design. So this was a really, really robust data set. All right, going down to the next one. So what's happening now? In addition to that earlier remedial investigation, we completed another round of sampling and studies between 2020 and 2022. More soil sampling, more sediment sampling, groundwater sampling, high resolution bathymetric surveys, you name it, pore water sampling. And all of that was done to fill remaining data gaps that we would need to move us into a feasibility study where we could start developing remedial alternatives for the cleanup. And that investigation just wrapped up. We just got the report in at the end of last month, and it just got posted. So if folks are interested in that, we can provide a link for you. It's a big document. I think it was like 23,000 pages with all of the lab reports. But I can certainly help folks navigate it if you're interested. But, oh, sorry, was there a comment?
Don't see anything in the chat.
Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something. So what it confirmed, though, even though this investigation was done, 10 or more years later, it confirmed what we already knew, that we still have these very, very high levels of contamination near the former outfalls. And you can see that in this figure here off to the right. The areas in the dark red and the hatched purple areas are where we have these high levels of arsenic and dioxin furans. And you'll also note that the contamination is widespread. So while the area of the highest concentrations is fairly focused, we do have levels well above background throughout almost the entire site. So if you look at dioxin furans, for example, the background value is 5. And that's what you would expect to see, like out in the bay, away from the site. And everything in that hatched yellow is above 50, so more than 10 times background. So when we're talking about elevated concentrations, we're talking 10, 100, and sometimes 1,000 times background. So it's a very, very heavily contaminated site. So with that in mind, a typical cleanup of this magnitude would take somewhere between 10 to 15 years to complete. But with the levels that we have at this site, DEQ is currently working with our state contractor to look through options and decide whether we would want to pursue an accelerated cleanup for those areas with the highest levels of contamination. That would put us closer to 5 years in terms of physically removing the sediments with the highest levels. So that's something we're currently contemplating as we continue to digest the results of that data gaps investigation. So that's kind of where we're at now. We do intend to continue coordinating with tribes as we work through this process. We meet with tribes on an annual basis to provide updates to them. And now that we are starting to really move quickly through the kind of feasibility study phase, we're also interested in coordinating more with other partners such as yourselves, the community, and other, whoever would be interested. So this really is an important time frame since we have our settlement funds to work with. It's a limited pot of money, and we want to make sure that we're collaborating early on to make best use of those funds. So that's all I have for Armstrong. Are there any questions on that before we move on to Pope and Talbot?
Yeah, Sarah, this is Greg Pettit. Thank you for the presentation, very thorough. My only question I really have is, what did they actually make there? Was it plywood or particle board, or imagine it was a lot of different things over the years, but.
Yeah, it was always some kind of fiber board. At one point it was mineral board. Other times it was just fiber. So it did kind of change in terms of its raw materials over time. But it would be, for example, they made a lot of these canting strips that are used for roofing, where they would press it into kind of this triangular shaped strip and then cut it into different sizes. Most recently, Armstrong made ceiling tiles. So they were using more of a clay kind of raw material, but still pressing it into boards and using it for like acoustic ceiling tiles. But it's always been some kind of pressed wood or mineral fiber product.
Okay. And do you know which processes were responsible for most of the dioxins and furans?
We think that a lot of it was associated with pentachlorophenol that they were using, kind of the byproduct of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I have two questions. One is, I'm fascinated with this upland because I suspect it's full of native oak trees. Mm-hmm. And I know you can't probably comment in any specific way, but what potential uses might happen in that upland property? So will it remain zoned for heavy industry, and will it be returned to heavy industry?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question. So when you look at, this is a great figure to look at here, because the upland we really delineated to just be the industrial area, and there aren't a lot of high value plants there. It's basically manicured lawns and what they planted. But if you look just to the east, kind of in that area where Blair is pointing, we have a lot of really nice oaks. Beautiful oaks. And there's even more up to the north and towards Railroad Avenue, where there isn't a lot of contamination, but it is still owned by Armstrong and would be conveyed to whoever a future property owner is. So what we have done is, likely if someone wants to purchase the property, they would enter into our prospective purchaser agreement program. And through that, we can kind of stipulate what they can do or can't do. And so the current plan that we are actively kind of discussing with Armstrong so that they can inform the buyers on is to set aside the entire lowland in a conservation easement of some sort. So that one, we can do our work without having to deal with more operations, and also so that we can maximize restoration opportunities once we've completed the cleanup. So yes, the upland portion, the 36 acres, is always going to be industrial, but we are trying to set aside that larger 100+ acres of wetland.
So there's really no conservation easement for the oak property. Is that what you just said?
No, that is included in the lowland. It's a little hard to tell, but
oh, I see. Okay, when you said lowland, you lost me. Well, I just want to say that I almost feel like it would be kind of a cosmic justice if the oaks could be protected as sort of a form of mitigation for the harmful, harsh shockingly devastating environmental impact that took place there. And so anything you can do to protect these native oaks, they're just an incredible resource for the community. My second question is about the, not just lowland, but the wetland area, the red zone, where the outfalls made the absolutely worst pollution, and you may physically remove that sediment. Will you be putting something there in to fill in, or just take out and leave it as bigger holes?
Yeah.
After you've removed, then what?
That's a great question, and that's something we're still talking through. I think we would have to fill it, but the question is, to what elevation do we bring it back to? There's a lot of willow habitat there, and wapato, and there are some beliefs that the discharge of the outfalls with all that fiber had kind of artificially raised elevations in that area. So there's some thought about bringing it back to the elevation where wapato would thrive, is an idea. So we have to go through permitting, and we'll have to figure out exactly, you know, how everything shakes out. But our goal would be to find elevations that encourage more of the native plants.
I do want to say on that note, and that sounds promising, I've seen it happen that fill material is brought in that's contaminated. Our friend had the power company brought rock, and it was infested with foxglove in his case, and he got thousands, zillions of foxglove. I want to make sure that any fill that comes in is not full of some sort of native weed seeds.
Right.
Whether it's purple loosestrife or yellow flag iris or some less wetland oriented, you know, weeds, teasel, there's a million possibilities. So I would just be very careful about what you put in there.
That's really good input. Thank you for that. We always test it for chemicals of concern, but thinking about kind of the seed bank and everything is really a good thought. So I'll definitely make sure that we include that. Appreciate that. All right, well, I can always answer more questions afterwards, but I want to make sure the other folks have time. So go for it, Blair, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
All right, here we go. So I just started getting you curious about the next presentation by putting some links in the chat to some documents related to the former Pope and Talbot cleanup site. So I will dive in now to talking about this site. So like Sarah mentioned earlier at the beginning, excuse me, there we go. The Pope and Talbot site is just north of the Armstrong site on the Scappoose Bay shoreline. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some background about the site and the historical uses. So the Pope and Talbot site, you can see here a picture of what it looked like when it was in operations. Sorry, too much zooming.
Wrong direction. Oh.
I zoomed in for one of Sarah's graphics and it was too much, and I realized you couldn't see my picture. Okay, we're good. So this site was used by the former Pope and Talbot company for wood treating from about 1912 to 1960. This is an old picture of the former operations at the site. You can see there were a lot of different structures in place in the upland areas of the site, as well as moving out into the in-water. Pope and Talbot mostly used creosote. That was the dominant wood treating material that they used at this site, which, if anyone is not familiar with creosote, you can see an image here as an example. It's a dense tar-like liquid that is made up of a mixture of different hydrocarbons, really dense, really sticky, sticks around in the environment once it's there. You might have seen creosote before on telephone poles or railroad ties. It's used basically to keep wood from rotting when it gets wet, and as I believe a bit of a fungicide as well. But like I said, the Pope and Talbot company had this creosote wood treating operation on this site for about half of the previous century. Their operations did stop there in 1960, and they dismantled most of the buildings after that. And then the property is now owned by the Port of Columbia County, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But while we're here, like I said, I wanted to orient you a little bit to the operations on the site. So you can see Scappoose Bay here, and in the upland area, you can see all of these different creosote tanks, pipelines, storage houses. So there's a lot of different activity in the upland area, which makes sense based on the information we now have as far as where the contamination is in the upland. And so you can imagine there would have been spills and things like that going on up here, maybe some leaky tanks. And then moving into the in-water area, like I said, this is Scappoose Bay. So you can see there's multiple docks here that would have been used to move that treated wood and probably some raw material too, that extend out over the in-water areas in that near shore area of Scappoose Bay. So you can see all this dock structure, infrastructure, as well as like this is a hog fuel loading conveyor belt. So you can imagine that treated wood as well as raw material might have fallen off of these docks over the decades that this was in operation, leading to in-water impacts as well. It's also worth noting that, as with all of these sites, they're in Scappoose Bay, they're right in the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, so I don't have to tell you this, right? But it's right at that confluence of the Willamette and Columbia watershed. So, of course, a really sensitive aquatic ecosystem that it's important to protect. And the site is also bordered on the west side, this kind of southwest side, by Milton Creek, which is right in between the Armstrong site and then the Pope and Talbot site. As I mentioned, a lot of the former structures that were part of the Pope and Talbot wood treating facility were dismantled after the site was stopped having its former industrial use in the 1960s. The Port of Columbia County, formerly known as the Port of St. Helens, purchased the property in 1963. And between 1963 and 1973, the site was filled in with a lot of dredge sand. That's what this white material is. And that matters because that material now overlays the former ground surface in all of the upland area. So on top of wherever there might have been spills or impacts from the site before, it's covered with this dredge sand. And then this is a picture from 2013. Some of you may be familiar with what the site looks like now, but this is more or less what the site looks like from the air or the water. You can see the Armstrong site over here. But this is the Pope and Talbot site, this big area. It's about 42 acres. And we'll talk in more detail about some of the areas along the shoreline. But as far as the upland, what you can see now, most of the structures no longer are in place. And since then, it's been largely vacant since the Pope and Talbot operations ceased in the 1960s. There have been a variety of different mixed industrial uses that have leased the property, but mostly more smaller scale privately owned businesses that have leased different portions of the property. But I would say all of the impacts that we're focused on, or the vast majority of the environmental impacts that we're focused on, come from that creosote operation prior to 1960. So DEQ has been involved with this site for a very long time. Environmental investigations started in 1989 and have continued in various different capacities since then. There have been a lot of environmental investigation and sampling in the upland and soil and groundwater, as well as increasingly in recent years, looking at those in-water impacts. We know of course, that it's a sensitive aquatic environment. And you can see, this is a more modern picture, you can see there's still some of those pilings from the former dock structures extending out into the bay. And so again, we had a lot of reason to suspect that there would be those in-water impacts. And then as the investigation has gone on, the evidence for those in-water impacts has gotten, that body of evidence has grown. And so there's been a lot of investigation in the sediment, in the surface water. And then in more recent years, DEQ requested a more thorough evaluation of impacts to the aquatic ecosystem as well. And so they went out and did some more concerted surface water as well as sediment pore water sampling along the shorelines and out into the bay. So a lot of data that's been collected over the years. As far as the regulatory history, the environmental regulatory history, DEQ entered an agreement, issued a consent order with the Port and Pope and Talbot in 1995. And then that work, Pope and Talbot did a lot of the upland investigation. And then in 2007, Pope and Talbot declared bankruptcy, similar to what Sarah described on the Armstrong site. And so since then, DEQ has been working with the Port of Columbia County to move the environmental investigations forward. And all of the remedial investigation was completed in 2020. The Port completed that supplemental remedial investigation that we had requested, like I said, to more thoroughly characterize some of the aquatic ecosystem impacts. And that included also an updated human health and ecological risk assessment, and like I said, a more comprehensive investigation of the in-water impacts. And so decades of investigation leading us to where we are now. At a high level, the findings are more or less what we would have anticipated based on what we knew about the uses of that creosote facility. The majority of the contaminants that we're concerned about at this site are associated with that creosote that was used by Pope and Talbot. One of the main classes of contaminants that we are focused on is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which we abbreviate as PAHs, and those are a main constituent in creosote. Like I said, creosote is that dense tar-like mixture of a bunch of different hydrocarbons. PAHs are part of that. And so I know this figure might be hard to see the details, but the point here is that all of these are little tables that show you concentrations of PAHs that were measured in the upland as well as in the in-water over all of the different years of investigation. Notable other things on this figure, this red line right here in the upland shows more or less the extent that we infer of impacts of that creosote in the upland. So actual creosote that dripped kind of down into the subsurface in the upland that is sort of pooled there in the groundwater and the subsurface. And then these pink shading areas indicate areas where we know that there's contamination seeping from the upland into the in-water, both in Milton Creek here and then along the Scappoose Bay shoreline. So those are areas that we're wanting to prioritize as far as cleanup. And then I mentioned that supplemental investigation that was completed in 2020 included evaluations of environmental and human health of risks associated with that contamination. And all of that concluded that there are risks to both environmental and human health associated with the concentrations of chemicals that have been measured at the site. In the upland, those risks are mostly concentrated around industrial workers and excavation workers and construction workers who might be working on the site in the future. Whereas in the in-water, those risks are mostly focused on aquatic plants and animals, as well as subsistence fishers who might be consuming the fish or shellfish that are impacted by these contaminants. where we stand right now is that like I said, remedial investigation was completed in 2020. And then after that, DEQ identified, based on all that data and investigation, 5 different what we call priority action areas for cleanup. And one of those is in the upland, and then 4 are in the aquatic areas and water. And we worked with the port to develop a feasibility study that evaluates a range of different cleanup options for each of those priority action areas. Something that's kind of unique about this site is that we are using petroleum sheen, which you can see here, both in the sediment and the in-water areas, as an indicator of where we're seeing those site-related impacts. And that's something that comes up in the feasibility study. And as well as in the staff report. So this brings us all the way up to the present day. Earlier this year, just in May, we completed what's called a staff report for the site. And basically this summarizes our recommended cleanup plan for all of these different priority action areas. And I want to mention, I put some links in the chat. One of those is to the staff report that I just mentioned. That is our document summarizing our cleanup plan for these 5 different priority action areas at the Pope and Talbot site. We are currently in the formal public comment period. So part of the reason we wanted to talk with you all now was because of that, because anyone is welcome to submit comments in writing on our cleanup plan. And we encourage folks to do that. And you all are a partner to DEQ in this area. And so I think that that's important. I put a link in the chat both to the actual staff report that goes into detail about the cleanup plan that we've laid out, as well as my email address, which is a place you can submit public comments. And I also put a link to a recording of a public presentation that I gave a few weeks ago that goes into more detail about the cleanup plan. So feel free to ask questions or reach out if you want more on that, but I wanted to go ahead and orient you to those things that I put in the chat. So at a high level here, I want to make sure Jeff has time to talk about the 3rd site, but at a high level, like I said, there's 5 different priority action areas that we're proposing cleanup for at the site. One is this upland area 1, which is kind of the southwest half of the upland area. I should mention that upland area 2 already has been addressed by DEQ. It received what we call a no further action letter in 2012. So it's not part of this current planning. So we've got upland area 1 priority action area, as well as 4 different in-water areas, 1 in Milton Creek here, Upper Milton Creek, and then 3 along the Scappoose Bay shoreline, the Cove, as well as the area 1 dock and area 2 dock, where there were those former docks that we talked about earlier. And then I also want to mention that, like I said, we're using petroleum sheen as an indicator of site-related impacts, and that is shown based on this yellow shading here. And so next steps are for us to receive the public comments that we receive, incorporate those into what's called the record of decision, which will be the final DEQ cleanup document, documenting our plan for cleaning up the site. And then we'll move into what's called remedial design, which is working with the port to figure out what other information might be needed to refine that cleanup plan. And then we'll move into implementation. And a priority of that will be making sure that the cleanup will be protective of those human and ecological health impacts that were identified in the risk assessments. Got a few more pictures of just site impacts. You can see kind of some creosote in the sediment here, and more sheen, more pictures from the sampling. More sheen. You see here some of that like old woody debris that's also a priority to clean up in the sediment areas and all these pilings. And with that, we could take a few questions now. Sure, yeah.
How dangerous was it back when in the mid 70s, 80s, 90s that I paddled almost weekly through all that stuff for many years?
all this woody debris and all of that.
Yep, along all those shorelines, all that coming out. I still remember believe one of those buildings used to have a whole bunch of water that would come pouring out like 20, 30 feet above the water and go crashing into the bay. And we paddle right over there next to that stuff. So, God, I wish I would have known what I know now. I wouldn't have done so much boating in that area.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That's a really good question. It can be a difficult question to answer in a really specific way. In general, I'm an environmental toxicologist, and in toxicology, we say the dose makes the poison. So, if you're paddling by something, a few times a week, that's going to be really different than if you were, for instance, working on the site or eating fish that lived right there, crayfish, resident fish, something like that. So I don't know.
We'd be out so many hours, we'd be eating lunch, our hands would be wet from the water in that area from, being that close to the water. And we just eat our lunches and
Sure. Yeah.
everything else without knowing what was down there. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to ask a related question to that, which is, when will they ever post "do not eat fish," around Kelly Point Park in North Portland? There's signage in 5 languages that do not eat the fish from this water, but there's no signage there.
That's a really good question. Like Sarah mentioned, there is a fish advisory issued by Oregon Health Authority in the area. I totally hear you that is not going to be as impactful if that message is not getting to people who are actually out there. Sarah came off mute. I don't know if she has more to say to that.
I was actually laughing a little bit because the only reason that there's signage along the Willamette in Portland Harbor is because there's a Superfund site, and even there, they were only able to purchase 7 signs and had a lot of trouble getting people to post them, pay for them, replace them if they get damaged. And so I think that's just a really good thing that we need to think about, because it is a really important piece of all of our cleanups until it gets back to safe levels, which could take some time. We need effective institutional controls, and we call fish advisory an institutional control. So I don't have a good answer for you, but it is surprising how hard it is to put up signs, something that seems so easy.
Because I'm a little bit concerned in some of that, because you've got a lot of bank fishermen that go along the nature trail at the Scappoose Bay Marina. And, hopefully they know you're not supposed to keep any of those fish and eat them, but there's no posting. Most people, the campground, you got a nature trail, doesn't they say thing 1 about not eating fish? And that's almost an important area too, to think about, that there should be signage to warn people that are going out there that are catching fish.
Yeah.
It would be important, I think, to distinguish, because that's a huge commercial fishing area. I mean, for sport fishing, probably 100 guides operate out there, but they're fishing for salmon, which only transit through the area. They're not growing up in the area or living in the area. But there is a smaller fishery for bass and sometimes walleye and catfish and stuff that are resident fish. There should be something to let people know those are the fish that need to be worried about, I think.
That's right.
Blair,
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
My name is Sam Lloyd, and I'm my company is currently submitting proposals for an alternate technology to specifically treat creosote contamination. My question to you is, when is the final date that the Columbia Port Authority will make a decision on which remediation method they will utilize for that location?
Thank you for the question. Like I said, we're in the public comment period right now for the DEQ recommended cleanup plan in the general, as far as this area needs to be removed, this area needs to be covered, things like that. What will happen after that is that we move into what we call the remedial design phase, which is where we make a lot more of those types of decisions. So the short answer is that there's a good bit of time still before the final decisions are made as far as what technologies are used.
Now, when you say time, are we saying like 6 months, a year, 2 years when the decision is made?
Probably a few years.
2 years. Okay. Thank you.
And feel free to reach out. I can, put you in touch with folks if that's useful.
Absolutely. I will be getting in contact with you tomorrow.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, one more quick question then. You
Mhm.
raised an interesting question. And that is, I know that the city of St. Helens keeps talking about wanting to accept only the clean dredge spoils from the city of Portland Superfund site. Are they thinking of any of these soils from any of these sites may possibly end up in the St. Helens sewage lagoon if they do decide to fill it in?
I don't know the specific answer to that question. I know in general, we have criteria that we use to determine whether dredge material is able to be put elsewhere, for instance. Like if sometimes they, you would dredge material and use it as fill in the upland or something like that. So we do have a set of screening criteria that are specific for that. A landfill is different. And so I'm not sure, honestly, whether it's being considered that anything dredged out of Scappoose Bay would go into that landfill or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what else is on the agenda. We might have more time for questions after Jeff talks about Boise, but I want to make sure that he has some time. So I will yield to Jeff.
Yeah, and as far as time goes, we're good to go. Our meeting typically goes for 1 hour to 2 hours. So take the time that you need to cover what you think that we need to hear.
Well, great. Thank you. And Blair, I hope my colleague Blair will still be willing to drive and move the mouse for me since she's got the permission. But again, just as a reminder, I'm Jeff Schatz. I'm the project manager for the former Boise mill site. And it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I don't think I've previously spoken directly to the council, so I appreciate this opportunity very much. So I want to talk about the former Boise mill site, but what I thought I would do first is maybe point out some highlights of the photograph kind of that you're seeing on the right side of the screen. This is a shot from early 1970 era. And I think it's a really neat shot and kind of why we wanted to include it in tonight's presentation. Up in the upper right corner, you can see part of the community of St. Helens. You can obviously see Scappoose Bay there in the center. And what's great about this photograph is it actually shows all three sites that we're discussing this evening. On the far right there, towards the center, is the former Boise mill site, obviously in a state of current active operation. Just upstream of that is Blair's former Pope and Talbot site, which I think is a great shot of some of the imported fill sands that were actually brought into that site a few decades ago, looking fairly fresh there. And then on the far left is the Armstrong site. So it's really kind of a great shot that shows all three of these cleanup sites and Scappoose Bay and how they relate to each other. But so talking about the former mill site, the former Boise site was developed as a bleached pulp and paper mill in the early 1920s. And I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this, but bleached pulp paper mills, it's a very aggressive process. You're basically taking wood chips and you're subjecting them to heat and a lot of really caustic chemicals to kind of reduce it down to a pulp-like, kind of a fibrous, pulpy material. That material is then further subjected to harsh chemicals in the bleaching process. And so the bleached pulp is ultimately pressed into paper. And kind of consistent with the industry standards in effect at the time, all the wastewater generated from that process was simply discharged untreated to Multnomah Channel. And so going back to the photograph there on the right, it's slightly cut off, but there's an arrow that points to this 36-inch wastewater outfall location. So from the 20s until sometime in the early 1970s, all the wastewater from the plant just spilled right out of there and right into the channel. So starting in about the 1950s, there were a series of documented fish kill events and some measurements of oxygen and biological oxygen demand were made in Multnomah Channel and started to show that there was a real problem. So in 1966, they constructed a primary clarifier. That's that dark circular feature. Maybe Blair can point that out. That circular feature there, kind of on the left side of the mill site there. And the purpose of the primary clarifier was to remove solids. At least they wanted to at least start removing the gross solids from the wastewater stream, which continued to pour out this outfall. Finally, in about 1970, the city of St. Helens, jointly with Boise, started construction on a wastewater treatment plant to, basically treat those wastewater fluids before discharge to try and make the situation better. Now, as of the time of this photograph, the wastewater treatment plant had not yet been constructed, but you can sort of see it as that kind of blank patch with a little bit of water showing there just kind of north of those piles of sawdust. So that's the future location of the wastewater treatment plant. So in about 1972, that plant was completed, and subsequently all of the plant wastewater, and that's roughly 34 million gallons a day, was directed to the wastewater treatment plant for treatment prior to discharge. So, a huge milestone in the environmental history of the site was when that occurred. So by about 2008, all of the pulping and bleaching operations had been ceased at the former mill site. So they continued to manufacture paper, but the pulp was brought to the site and it was bleached elsewhere, and so they basically just brought bleached pulp to the site and would make paper using it. So after 2008, the environmental impact of the facility really diminished greatly. And so they started to actually decommission and remove parts of the mill that were no longer in use. And that continued slowly over the next few years. In 2015, the city of St. Helens actually purchased the former mill site, although a portion of the site is still leased to Cascade Tissue Group of Oregon, and some limited tissue manufacturing actually continues to the present day. As mentioned by Blair and Sarah, the city of St. Helens is currently looking to redevelop its waterfront. And that would include, those plans would include the use of the former mill site, which is about 200 acres in size, as an industrial business park. And associated with this project, there will also be recreational areas, community centers, urban housing, commercial businesses, pedestrian trails, and probably even a marina, in the near to and in the general area of the former mill site. There's actually an inserted link to the City of St. Helens development plans for the waterfront redevelopment project inserted there in the story map. Blair, could you move on down? Okay, so what are the contaminants that we are talking about? Investigations over the years have shown that surface and subsurface sediments in the Multnomah Channel adjacent to the former mill site have been impacted by a number of contaminants, including polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, dioxins and furans, also the polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, that were mentioned previously for the Pope and Talbot site, and then metals including arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury, and also small amounts, minor amounts of petroleum hydrocarbon sheen, although it's of a different kind of sheen than the creosote that was, characterized at the nearby site, the Pope and Talbot. So of those compounds, the PCBs and the DOX and spherins are kind of considered to be the worst actors, worst players in those contaminant lists, in that they are strongly bioaccumulative. The PCBs and DOX and spherins were largely generated by reactions during those chemical reactions that created the wastewater streams from the mill site. PAHs, came from spills of petroleum. There was a lot of overwater activities related to barges and barge fueling where there were spills. Metals come from a variety of sources, including machine shop operations, sandblasting, things of that nature. But of all those compounds, really the main driver of risk at the site are the PCBs. And those PCBs, they pose risk to, kind of a variety of receptors. First and foremost being recreational and subsistence fishers who consume that fish and also provide that fish to children. So off to the right, kind of a show of an example of kinds of fishing that might be done. It looks like some of these fish that are being caught here, these might be resident fish and not so much the fish that kind of pass through, like the salmon that we're talking about. So we're very worried about situations like this where people are consuming fish on a regular basis, either recreationally or for a subsistence basis. Other pathways or concern that contamination poses risk to would be fish consuming prey that themselves have been impacted by the contaminants, so actual dangers to the fish. Also mammals and birds that are consuming prey impacted by the contaminants, including fish from Multnomah Channel. And then also recreational and transient trespassers that come in contact with contaminated sediments. And as mentioned previously by my colleagues, in 2020, an advisory on the consumption of resident fish, shellfish, and crayfish was issued for Scappoose Bay in an attempt to try to help manage human health risks. But obviously, as discussed, we need to do a better job of making sure that that information is communicated. So Blair, can you scroll down a little bit? Thank you. Okay, so then actually, what is the scope of this current cleanup action? So the figure to the right kind of shows the major geographic subdivisions of the site, kind of broken up into three broad areas. The area outlined in brown is the basically upland area of the former mill site. The thin purple hachured area is the riverbank area of the mill site. And then the three black outlined areas labeled mill areas 1, 2, and 3 is called the sediment area of the site. These mill areas are actually defined as starting at what's called the mean high water elevation, and they extend approximately 150 feet out into the channel. And collectively, mill areas 1, 2, and 3 comprise about 15 acres of area, submerged area. And so the focus of the current cleanup effort is actually the contaminated sediments in mill areas 1, 2, and 3. In addition, some areas of contaminated riverbank soils that are considered erodible and would therefore pose a possible recontamination risk to sediment in Multnomah Channel will also be addressed by this cleanup. However, the assessment and cleanup of the remainder of the site of the upland area and the remainder of the bank area will be done under a future agreement with the responsible party. So I just want to make it clear that this cleanup that we're talking about now is only for the in-water area, and you know, addresses these mill areas 1, 2, and 3. Can you scroll down? Okay, thank you, please. So over the years, a number of environmental investigations have been performed at the former mill site. They started back in 2001 when DEQ and EPA started to first kind of look at the site, and in particular, contamination associated with sediments. So the focus for investigation has always and early on focused on sediments. There was some data collected from the upland as well, but it's really been sediments been the focus. And so those investigations were performed to evaluate the magnitude and extent of that contamination. In April 2003, Boise Cascade entered into a voluntary agreement with DEQ to investigate and, as necessary, clean up the former mill site. So that was in April 2003. In October 2004, OfficeMax Incorporated, also just known as OfficeMax, assumed liability for the cleanup under the voluntary agreement from Boise. And so DEQ has been working with OfficeMax pretty much since that time. So the investigations continued, including the completion of a remedial investigation in 2007, and then with follow-up supplemental investigations completed in 2009 and 2014. And before I talk about the figure to the right, I just want to point out this small figure to the left that kind of just shows what a typical grab sediment sample from the surface looks like after it's been pulled out of the river, usually using some sort of a clamshell kind of a bucket kind of piece of equipment, and just kind of showing what the nature of sediment looks like, with certainly some debris, probably some organic debris here visible. So just to show you kind of example of what it looks like when it actually comes out of the water. But I want to talk a little bit about this figure to the right. It actually kind of summarizes some of the site investigation data collected most recently in the 2014 timeframe. And the purpose of this figure is to kind of show, basically show where the highest levels of contamination are in the sediments adjacent to the site. And what the figure actually depicts is the magnitude of exceedance of, basically the hotspot concentration. So levels of contamination that are, high enough that DEQ believes, needs to be treated or removed. That's a hotspot. And the scenario that's being evaluated by this figure is the subsistence fisher consuming fish from Multnomah Channel. And so the colors, as I indicated, represent the magnitude of exceedance of that hotspot concentration. So in general, the light blues and darker blues are going to be your lower levels of exceedance of that hotspot concentration. But when you start to move into the purples and the lighter purples and certainly the pinks, you're getting into very large magnitude exceedances of those hotspot concentrations. And in some cases, here in the center of Mill Area 2, being more than 1,000 times that hotspot concentration. So, what the figure really shows is that the most severe, the highest levels of contamination are within this Mill Area 2 area that's kind of near the center part of the former mill site. For geography purposes, the former wastewater outfall is about here, and then this is the overwater dock structure here. And you can definitely see that the highest levels of contamination, mainly PCBs, are in the central part of the site. Also, just wanted to point out that the investigations done over the years looked at not only surface sediments, but also subsurface sediments through coring. And as I indicated already, the highest levels of contamination in surface sediments are kind of in the middle of the site here, mill area 2. But in general, they also found that contaminant levels contaminants exceed further into the sediment below the mud line, and they generally increase in concentration as you go deeper. Thank you, Blair. Move on. Okay, so continuing with the environmental history, in 2020, Office Max completed the feasibility study for this sediment cleanup. And in the feasibility study, Office Max recommended a remedy consisting of a sediment isolation cap for the most contaminated sediments, primarily in mill area 2. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Okay, there we go. Something else popped up on the screen there. So in addition, near the dock area where it was potentially impracticable to construct a isolation cap, the feasibility study had recommended basically direct application of activated carbon to those sediments near the dock. Based on evidence that sediment is actively accumulating in the near shore area to the former mill site, it was assumed that areas with lower levels of contamination, generally mill areas 1 and 3, would naturally recover over time. And so what I wanted to point out was this figure to the right here. This is a figure showing what's called bathymetry for the nearshore sediments to the former mill site. And basically what the bathymetry is the elevation of the sediment surface itself. And so this figure shows bathymetry data that was collected over a 10-year period between 2010 and 2020. And I'll explain what the colors mean. The colors represent changes in the elevation of that sediment surface within that 10-year period. The light colors, grays, going up to blues, represent areas of scour, or where sediment is actually being eroded from the area, whereas the light pinks and oranges through the dark reds represent areas of deposition, where sediment is actively accumulating. And so, as shown by this figure, over the 10-year period between 2010 and 2020, there was approximately most of the color you see, especially in mill area 2, is this dark red, which shows that there was as much as 2 feet of deposition of sediment during that period. And so that was the basis for Office Max, proposing that some of the recovery of this site could recur naturally because sediment is actively being deposited at this time.
Jeff, I've got a question related to that. Do we know where that sediment is coming from? Because this particular site is downstream of 2 other fairly contaminated sites. And is that sediment any better than the sediment that's underneath it?
That's a really great question. Certainly, some of the input to the sediment coming into this area would be from all parts upstream. But as part of the remedial investigation, as part of the supplemental investigations, part of the work involved laying what's called sediment traps on the surface of the sediment for a period of time. And actually, those traps allow sediment to accumulate over a set period of time, and then they're recovered and they're tested. And so typically those are put kind of at the upstream side of some of these boundaries, these divisions, like we're looking at here with mill areas 1, 2, and 3. And so in 2014, they actually collected some sediment traps and placing them at the upstream side of mill area 3, the upstream side of mill area 2, and the upstream side of mill area 1 to try to get a feel for how contaminated the sediment coming into the area is or can be. So that has been looked at, and that has been tested, and it showed that in general the levels of sediment coming into the area were not that much different from areas that we consider background levels. So in this case, it actually showed that whatever's coming into the area is not horribly contaminated, but a little bit above background, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my question would be, is just because it's occurring sediment right now, in the future with more flooding happening and everything else, could it suddenly go the opposite way and the sediment would wash away and then re-expose all the bad stuff?
That is a good question too. And that's certainly something that we're going to try and get a better feel for. We're going to be doing, Office Max will be doing another round of bathymetry testing to kind of get some more current data, kind of see what the trends are long term. But yeah, that is definitely a possibility. One of the things that gives us a little bit of confidence that this deposition tendency is probably a good trend that's likely to continue is, as I said earlier, as you go deeper in the sediment, the levels just get worse and worse and worse. So it does kind of tell us that this has been occurring for some time and is probably likely to occur. As to whether increase flooding in the future from climate change, I mean, locally you might actually get more deposition because you're increasing air depth too, right? So there's very complicated hydrodynamics that go on.
Very complicated.
So we're going to try to tease that out and increase our level of confidence about deposition. But for now, we think that it's a pretty good model and that things will continue to accumulate generally over time. Okay, so I know I'm gonna finish this up here pretty quickly, but so what was the actual selected remedy? So Office Max had proposed an isolation cap. DEQ performed its own evaluation of remedial alternatives and actually ended up selecting a different cleanup approach than what had been proposed by Office Max. So in September 2022, DEQ prepared a staff report containing a proposed plan. And as documented in that staff report, DEQ selected a remedy that is not a isolation cap, an engineered isolation cap, but instead consists of what's called enhanced natural recovery. But in this case, that material would be amended with an activated amendment, something like activated carbon. And so generally what we're talking about is application of, generally thin sand layer between 6 and 12 inches. That sand layer would be amended with something like activated carbon at some percentage, with the intention is that activated carbon would bind up the contaminants like PCBs and dioxins, furans, and reduce their bioavailability to fish, benthic organisms, and those kinds of receptors. So what this figure to the right is kind of a conceptual remedy, showing what conceptual remedy is. And I want to make it clear that this is conceptual. Now that we're into remedial design, we will be collecting a whole new round of data to further characterize this and really hone in on where these different technologies would be applied. But as shown in this figure, mill area 2 shows this kind of blue hatchet pattern. That is the area where we believe that this amended enhanced natural recovery, so again, thin sand layers with some percentage of activated carbon would be applied. In the area adjacent to and underneath the dock structure shown by the green would probably be something where it's impracticable to try and lay sand with sand down effectively. We might actually direct apply activated carbon in that area to be more effective. The brown areas, largely mill areas 1 through 3 with the brown hash pattern, that would be, those would be areas that we would try to allow to naturally recover, but it would be monitored periodically to gauge the success of that, as to your point, to make sure that sediment's still being deposited and so forth, and how effective that is. And then certain areas, as I pointed out before, the purple stippled pattern is the riverbank. And so areas of the riverbank where there's levels of contamination in the riverbank soil, which are deemed to likely be erodible and therefore pose a recontamination risk, would be addressed. And so currently we're aware of one such area that needs to be addressed, but we might identify others in the investigations we're going to be doing now that we've entered remedial design. And could you go one more, Blair? So next steps, DEQ is working with Office Max right now to finalize a schedule for the remedial design phase of the project. We anticipate that a work plan for this pre-design investigation will be submitted in early 2024, with field work to be completed later on during the in-work window in 2024. Now we're early on in the remedial design process. There's several more steps to go, but generally we anticipate that this remedy could be constructed likely sometime in 2028 or 2029. And so as indicated by Blair, I have put a link to DEQ's XE database where various documents, including the staff report and the record of decision, which was issued in March of this year, 2023, can be seen. So are there any other questions?
Giving us lots of good information. Thank you.
So Jeff, this is Greg Pettit. Do you know how much of the contamination is absorbed in the particulate material, like in the sediments, and how much is actually in solution in the water? I guess the question I'm getting at is, as groundwater moves through the contaminated sediments, even though they're deeper, are they able to pick up dissolved concentrations of the contaminants and then have that discharge into the river?
So far, part of the remedial investigation, we did a very limited amount. We did some surface water testing, not a lot. So the surface water testing really actually showed very low levels. So it appears to be that the majority of the contamination is actually in the sediment itself. And as part of this pre-design investigation, we will be trying to take pore water samples. So basically kind of trying to see what's in the water, the interstitial water of the sediments, basically after it's discharged, transitional to discharge to the water. So we'll be looking at that closer, but the available data we have indicated that not a whole lot was partitioning into surface water.
And a follow-up, so you said this is just the in-water cleanup portion. What's the timing or what's the status of the out-of-water part of the site? Because that's all owned by the city now, and I'm wondering about the development plans for that area.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We definitely, I think we tried to focus on the sediment contamination, believing it was kind of the bigger problem. The thought is that once we are, along in remedial design and we're getting close to, maybe construction, we would probably be starting the process in the upland. So, I would say it's not imminent. It's probably, a handful of years out that we would start to look at that. But again, we think that the limited sampling or the amount of sampling that's been done in the upland as part of the remedial investigation, didn't show contamination levels that were of enough concern that we had to move forward with the upland simultaneously. So we feel like we have some time. It's not as much of a threat, but it's definitely a conversation that we'll be raising with the city and Office Max as soon as we feel like the remedial design of the in-water part is squared away.
All right, if there's no other questions, thank you all so much. This has been really interesting for me to hear this more in depth. I joined the Watershed Council back around 2016, and so one of the early presentations that I heard was from DEQ about this particular site. And it's nice to, with more understanding now, to come back and look at it and go, okay, a lot more of it's clicking together. The Watershed Council would love to partner with you in whatever ways we can. Please reach out to Rochelle for coordinating that.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for having us. This was great, and I think we will take you up on that offer. I know we've had ODF&W and NOAA, and I thought someone from the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council come kayaking with us at Armstrong and look at the different vegetation and think about, and maybe dream a little bit about what it could look like when it's all done. And I think we would love to do that again, because there's just so much opportunity there. I don't want to miss it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. We can definitely talk more in depth about possible collaborations. I'm looking forward to it. This was a really interesting presentation.
And I would add to that the question that came up about the signage, what the fish advisor is, to me, that feels like something that, it's always hard to know with limited resources and everything, like what's possible, but it seems like something that could be worth revisiting with our powers combined.
I would like to make a suggestion that, to me, and I'm just a novice at this, it seems like a no-brainer that a portion of the 70 million could be dedicated to signage, like $10,000 or something.
I was thinking the same thing. I will say everybody wants a piece of that 77 million. So I'm trying to protect it carefully because
Gonna go fast.
Our estimates for the cleanup were actually over 100 million, and we only got 77, which seems like a lot to everybody, but we do have a lot of work to do. But I agree that is a huge priority and one of the easiest things that we can do to protect people now. So I'm definitely taking notes, and I'll see what we can do. I think that's a really good thing to set our sights on.
I may not be remembering this correctly, but I think when the last time we had a presentation, I think Deb Bailey was still around.
Yeah.
They were talking about, I think it was the Armstrong site, about part of the remediation being creating more wetlands or preserving the wetlands or remediating those wetlands as part of the mitigation.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for clarifying a murky situation.
All right. Thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Right.
And I hope everybody has a great night.
All right.
Okay.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.